The vanishing of one of the most wanted men in history. In May 1945, as World War II was drawing to a close, American soldiers stopped an ordinary-looking man near the German city of Lüneburg. He wore a modest military uniform, carried a set of papers under the name Otto Eichmann, and appeared to be just another defeated soldier trying to make his way through the chaos that followed Germany's collapse. Nothing about him seemed remarkable. He cooperated fully, answered questions calmly, and never attracted suspicion. Yet, hidden behind that quiet demeanor was a secret that would remain undiscovered for months. During routine processing, officials noticed a blood-type tattoo beneath his arm, a marking commonly associated with certain elite military units of the era. But that clue alone wasn't enough to reveal who he really was. The problem was simple. There were no recent photographs available. Many government records had been destroyed during the final months of the war, and his name wasn't even listed among the highest priority targets being sought by Allied authorities. As a result, the man slipped through the system. For months, he lived among thousands of ordinary prisoners without anyone realizing his true identity. That man was Adolf Eichmann. At the time, few investigators understood that they were dealing with someone who had played a central role in organizing one of the largest deportation systems in modern history. By the time testimony and evidence emerging from the Nuremberg trials began pointing directly toward him, it was already too late. Eichmann had vanished. He escaped from an internment camp, assumed a new identity, and began building a life based on silence, caution, and anonymity. Years passed. Then, thousands of miles away from Europe, he resurfaced in an unlikely place, a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of Buenos Aires, Argentina. Under a different name and living an unremarkable life, he believed that time and distance had erased his trail forever. He was wrong. What followed would become one of the most dramatic international manhunts of the 20th century, a story involving secret identities, intelligence operations, hidden networks, and a capture that would capture the attention of the entire world. And even after the trial was over, the controversy did not end. New questions emerged. Questions about his family, questions about missing money, questions about sealed government files that remained hidden for decades. This is the story of how one of history's most elusive fugitives disappeared, how he was found, and how the consequences of his actions continued to echo long after the world believed the case was closed. Barrett Chapter 2: The Escape of the Century. On May 3, 1945, a US Army reconnaissance unit was operating near the forest surrounding Lüneburg in northern Germany. The war in Europe was effectively over. German military units were collapsing, soldiers were surrendering in massive numbers, and thousands were attempting to disappear before Allied forces could identify them. At one roadside checkpoint, American troops stopped a balding, middle-aged man wearing the worn uniform of a Luftwaffe non-commissioned officer. His papers identified him as Otto Eichmann. Nothing about him appeared unusual. He answered every question calmly, cooperated fully, and blended seamlessly into the endless stream of prisoners being processed during the chaotic final days of the war. Like countless others, he was sent into the Allied prisoner system. During routine screening, officials discovered a blood-type tattoo beneath his left arm, a marking often associated with members of the SS. But even that failed to raise serious suspicion. Thousands of former SS personnel were being processed at the time. Without photographs, reliable records, or intelligence reports linking the prisoner to major wartime activities, investigators had little reason to look further. The man was assigned a number and transferred to the internment camp at Cham, Bavaria. And there he remained. For 8 months, Adolf Eichmann lived among ordinary prisoners without anyone realizing who he truly was. When American interrogators questioned him, he presented a simple story. He claimed to have served on the Eastern Front. He said he had been wounded during the war. He insisted he knew nothing about concentration camps or the machinery of mass deportations. At the time, investigators had no evidence capable of disproving his claims. The irony was staggering. The man who had spent years coordinating transportation networks that moved millions of people across occupied Europe was now sitting across from Allied officers who had never even heard his name. Meanwhile, events were unfolding elsewhere. In November 1945, the Nuremberg trials began. For the first time, senior figures of the Nazi regime were being questioned before an international tribunal. Witnesses started providing testimony, documents emerged, names surfaced, and gradually, investigators began uncovering the administrative structure behind the regime's vast deportation system. Eichmann followed every development closely. From inside the camp, he read newspapers obsessively. Every testimony mattered. Every new document represented a potential threat. Each day, he evaluated the risk that someone might eventually connect the dots and discover where he was hiding. Then, in January 1946, an opportunity appeared. Security controls around prisoner work details had become increasingly relaxed. Administrative confusion remained widespread throughout the occupation zones. Taking advantage of the disorder, Eichmann joined a labor group assigned to forestry work outside the camp perimeter. When the workday ended, he simply didn't return. By the time authorities noticed his absence, he was already gone. No alarms. No dramatic chase. No immediate pursuit. Just one man disappearing into the forests of post-war Germany. For months afterward, he moved through remote rural areas under a new identity. He called himself Otto Henninger. He worked as a lumberjack. The pay was poor. The conditions were harsh. He lived in isolated cabins without electricity or modern conveniences. But that was exactly what he wanted. Visibility was dangerous. Anonymity was survival. He avoided contact with his family. He avoided drawing attention. He rarely spoke more than necessary. Even his Austrian accent began to disappear as he carefully adapted his speech to blend in with local populations. Later, when forestry work became scarce, he found employment on a poultry farm. The work was repetitive and exhausting. Yet for Eichmann, monotony was a form of protection. The less noticeable he became, the safer he was. Every morning, however, one habit never changed. He read the newspapers, carefully, systematically. The Nuremberg trials continued generating headlines, and Eichmann monitored every development. Then came the moment he had feared. Former officials began testifying under oath. One witness described him as a central organizer of deportation operations. Another identified him as a key figure within the transportation network that supplied extermination camps with a continuous flow of victims. Suddenly, his name was no longer hidden. It was appearing in court records, in newspaper reports, in intelligence files. The window of safety that had protected him since the war's end was beginning to close. For the first time, Eichmann realized a simple truth. Germany was no longer a safe place to hide. If he intended to survive, he would need to leave Europe entirely. And that decision would lead him toward a secret escape network that had already helped countless former Nazi officials disappear across the Atlantic. A network that stretched from Germany to Italy and ultimately to South America. Chapter 3. The Secret Route to South America. By 1946, Adolf Eichmann understood that remaining in Germany was becoming increasingly dangerous. His name had begun appearing in testimony at the Nuremberg trials. Former officials were identifying him. Investigators were slowly piecing together the chain of command behind the deportation system. For years, he had managed to remain invisible. Now, that invisibility was beginning to crack. The question was no longer whether someone would come looking for him. The question was when. And so, he made a decision that thousands of former Nazi officials and collaborators had already made before him. He would leave Europe. At the time, escaping to South America was not an impossible dream. A vast underground network had emerged in the aftermath of the war, helping fugitives cross borders, obtain documents, and disappear into new lives overseas. Contrary to popular belief, This was not a single organization with a clear leader. It was a loose web of sympathizers, corrupt officials, religious contacts, and facilitators operating across several countries. Each person handled a small part of the process. Together, they created an escape route that stretched from Central Europe to the ports of Italy, and from there to destinations thousands of miles away. One of the most important figures connected to these operations was an Austrian bishop named Alois Hudal. Based in Rome, Hudal had access to networks capable of providing shelter, recommendations, and documentation to individuals seeking new identities. After the war, numerous former members of the Nazi apparatus passed through channels linked to his circle. By 1950, Eichmann had reached the point where he was ready to activate his own escape. Traveling mostly in secret, he moved south through Austria and eventually entered Italy. The journey was slow and cautious. He avoided official routes whenever possible. He stayed in temporary accommodations. He kept conversations brief. Most importantly, he avoided attracting attention. Once in Italy, he was placed in a safe location, connected to the network assisting refugees and displaced persons. There, he waited for the final piece of the puzzle, a new identity. When the documents arrived, Adolf Eichmann effectively ceased to exist, at least on paper. In his place stood a man named Riccardo Clement. The passport carried his photograph, but everything else told a different story, a different name, a different background, a different life. The document had been issued through humanitarian channels designed to assist millions of displaced people struggling to rebuild their lives after the war. The sheer scale of the post-war refugee crisis made thorough verification extremely difficult. For those determined to exploit the system, opportunities existed. Eichmann became one of them. With his new identity secured, he traveled to the port city of Genoa. There, among ordinary passengers seeking better futures abroad, he boarded a ship bound for South America. The vessel was called the Giovanna C. On June 17, 1950, it departed from Italy. For nearly a month, the ship crossed the Atlantic. During the voyage, Eichmann kept to himself. He avoided friendships, avoided personal questions, avoided discussions about the past. The less people remembered him, the better. Every day that passed carried him farther from Europe, farther from the investigations, farther from the growing list of people searching for answers. Finally, in July 1950, the ship arrived in Buenos Aires. As passengers disembarked, no alarms sounded. No officials recognized him. No intelligence service was waiting at the dock. The man once known as Adolf Eichmann stepped onto Argentine soil as Riccardo Clement. After 5 years spent hiding across Europe, he had successfully escaped, and for the first time since the war ended, he believed he might have achieved something close to safety. Argentina, under President Juan Domingo Perón, had become home to thousands of European immigrants in the post-war years. Among them were many individuals seeking fresh starts, and others hoping to leave their pasts behind forever. For Eichmann, the country offered exactly what he needed: distance, anonymity, and the possibility of beginning again. What he could not know was that years later, a single conversation involving a teenage girl, a boastful young man, and a surname that should never have been mentioned would set in motion the chain of events that ultimately exposed him. The hunt was not over. In reality, it had only just begun. Chapter 4. How Mossad found Adolf Eichmann. For nearly a decade, Adolf Eichmann lived in Argentina under the name Riccardo Clement. He wasn't hiding in a luxurious estate, he wasn't protected by a private security force, and he wasn't living like a powerful man who had once occupied an important position inside the Third Reich. Instead, he lived in a modest house on Garibaldi Street, in the suburb of San Fernando, north of Buenos Aires. The neighborhood was unremarkable. Unpaved roads, simple homes, small gardens. Nothing that would attract attention. Every evening, at roughly the same time, Eichmann returned home from work. He was employed at a local factory and traveled by bus like thousands of ordinary workers. To anyone watching, he appeared completely average. But beneath that ordinary routine was a habit that revealed how deeply fear still shaped his life. Before entering his property each night, he would quietly inspect the area around his house. He looked for footprints, disturbed soil, broken branches, anything that might suggest someone had been watching. The war had ended years earlier, yet Eichmann never stopped looking over his shoulder. Inside the home, life was equally austere. For a time, the house had no electricity. The furniture was basic. The family avoided unnecessary attention. Even Eichmann's children were taught strict rules about what they could say outside the home. They learned not to use their real surname. They learned to refer to their father by the identity he had created. Everything revolved around maintaining the illusion, and for years, it worked. Then, in 1957, something happened that would change everything. Hundreds of miles away, in a small town within Argentina, lived a man named Lothar Hermann. Hermann was a survivor of Nazi persecution. Years earlier, he had fled Germany and rebuilt his life in South America. Although his eyesight had been severely damaged, his memory remained sharp. One day, his teenage daughter Sylvia became acquainted with a young German immigrant named Klaus. At first, there seemed to be nothing unusual about him. But Klaus had a habit of talking, and talking too much. He often spoke proudly about his family. He boasted that his father had once been an important officer during the war. He hinted at connections to major figures within the Nazi regime. Most importantly, he mentioned his family name, Eichmann. When Hermann heard the surname, it immediately caught his attention. The name was not common, and it was one he remembered from reports surrounding the Nuremberg trials. The more details he heard, the more concerned he became. Could it really be the same Eichmann? At first, he wasn't sure, but the possibility was too significant to ignore. He asked Sylvia to learn more. Without fully understanding the importance of what she was doing, she continued speaking with Klaus. Over time, she gathered valuable information: where the family lived, where Klaus's father worked, and perhaps most importantly, confirmation that within the family circle, the man was still known as Adolf Eichmann. Hermann became convinced. Now he faced a different problem. How could he make someone listen? He began writing letters, lots of them. Letters describing what he believed he had discovered. Letters sent to officials and authorities who might be able to investigate. Most received little attention. Some received no response at all. After all, the claim sounded almost unbelievable. A man living in a small Argentine town was insisting he had found one of the world's most wanted fugitives. Many dismissed it, others simply ignored it. But eventually, one of those letters reached a man who took it seriously. His name was Fritz Bauer. Bauer was one of West Germany's most determined prosecutors. Unlike many officials of the post-war era, he was deeply committed to pursuing those responsible for Nazi crimes. When he reviewed Hermann's information and compared it with existing records, he saw something others had missed. The lead was credible, perhaps even convincing. Yet Bauer faced a serious obstacle. He did not trust many parts of the system he worked within. Too many former officials from the Nazi era still occupied positions of influence in post-war Germany. If he submitted information through normal channels, there was a risk that word could leak. And if Eichmann received a warning, he might disappear again. This time, perhaps forever. Bauer made a remarkable decision. Instead of following the usual procedures, he secretly contacted Israeli intelligence. He bypassed official channels entirely. It was a risky move, but he believed it was the only realistic chance of bringing Eichmann to justice. The information eventually reached the attention of Mossad, Israel's intelligence service. At first, Mossad remained cautious. The organization had received reports before. Many turned out to be false. But this lead felt different. The details were unusually specific. The address existed, the family existed, and the surname was impossible to ignore. A decision was made. Before any action could be considered, they needed proof. Absolute proof. An intelligence officer named Zvi Aharoni was sent to Argentina. His mission was simple: find out whether Ricardo Clement and Adolf Eichmann were the same man. For weeks, Aharoni conducted surveillance. He observed Eichmann's daily routine, watched him leave work, followed him through the streets, studied every detail. Then came the breakthrough. During one surveillance operation, Aharoni boarded the same bus Eichmann used for his commute. He sat directly behind him. Hidden inside a briefcase was a camera. At the right moment, he quietly took several photographs. The images captured one of the most distinctive features of the suspect's appearance: his ears. Investigators compared the photographs with historical records. The match was extraordinary. The shape, proportions, and structure aligned perfectly. After years of uncertainty, Mossad finally had what it needed. The conclusion was unavoidable. Ricardo Clement was not an ordinary factory worker. He was Adolf Eichmann. And now that they had found him, the next question was far more complicated. How do you capture one of the most wanted men in the world without anyone noticing? Chapter 5. The Kidnapping Operation. Once Mossad confirmed that Ricardo Clement was, in fact, Adolf Eichmann, the mission entered a completely new phase. Finding him had been difficult. Taking him was going to be even harder. Argentina was a sovereign nation. Eichmann was living there legally under his assumed identity. Any official attempt to arrest or extradite him risked triggering a diplomatic crisis, or worse, giving him enough time to disappear once again. The Israeli government faced a difficult choice: wait for a legal solution that might never come, or act. They chose to act. The operation was given the codename Operation Dibuk. A special team of intelligence officers was assembled and quietly sent to Buenos Aires. Their mission was straightforward in theory: capture Adolf Eichmann alive and bring him to Israel. In reality, nothing about the plan was simple. The agents rented a safe house in the city. Inside, they spent weeks studying every detail of Eichmann's routine: his work schedule, his bus route, his walking speed, the exact time he returned home. Every movement was documented, every possibility was considered. Among the agents assigned to the mission was Peter Malkin, a specialist in covert operations. For Malkin, the mission carried a deeply personal weight. Many members of his family had been killed during the war. Yet he knew personal emotions could not interfere with the operation. Their objective was not revenge. Their objective was to bring Eichmann to trial. For weeks, the team rehearsed the capture repeatedly. They practiced routes. They rehearsed contingencies. They even studied how to approach Eichmann in a way that would minimize resistance and prevent attention from nearby residents. Everything depended on precision. One mistake could destroy years of work. Finally, they selected the date: May 11th, 1960. That evening, as usual, Eichmann boarded the bus that carried him home from work. Nothing seemed different. Nothing appeared unusual. Like countless evenings before, he stepped off the bus and began walking toward Garibaldi Street. He had no idea he was being watched. Several Mossad agents were already in position. A vehicle waited nearby. The street was quiet. The timing had to be perfect. As Eichmann walked along the road, Peter Malkin approached him. The agent later recalled using a simple phrase in Spanish: "Un momentito, señor." "Just a moment, sir." Eichmann turned. In an instant, the agents moved. Malkin grabbed him. Other team members rushed forward. Within seconds, they forced him into the waiting vehicle. The entire operation lasted less than 10 seconds. No gunfire, no public confrontation, no dramatic chase. One of the most wanted fugitives in the world had simply vanished from the street. As the vehicle sped away, Eichmann remained stunned. The speed of the operation left him little time to react. For years he had lived cautiously. For years he had expected danger. Yet when it finally arrived, it came faster than he could comprehend. The team transported him to a secret safe house outside the city. There, for the first time, Eichmann realized exactly who had taken him, and why. For the next 9 days, he remained hidden, while Mossad agents worked to confirm his identity beyond any possible doubt. At first, Eichmann tried to evade questions. He hesitated. He altered details. He avoided direct admissions. The interrogators remained patient. They already knew who he was. They simply needed him to say it himself. Eventually, the resistance faded. After years of hiding behind false names and fabricated histories, the truth finally emerged. Speaking quietly, he acknowledged his real identity. He was Adolf Eichmann. The confession was recorded. The mission had succeeded. Or at least, the first part of it had. Now came the most dangerous challenge of all: getting him out of Argentina. Because capturing Eichmann had been difficult, smuggling him out of the country, without authorities discovering the operation, would be even more risky. One mistake could unravel everything, and the clock was already ticking. Chapter 6: The Secret Flight to Israel. Capturing Adolf Eichmann was only half the mission. Now Mossad faced an even greater challenge. How do you secretly move one of the world's most wanted fugitives out of a foreign country without attracting attention? The operation had already crossed a dangerous line. If Argentine authorities discovered Eichmann's whereabouts before he left the country, the consequences could be enormous. The mission could collapse overnight. International headlines would follow. Diplomatic tensions would escalate. And perhaps most importantly, Eichmann might never stand trial. The agents knew they had very little time. For 9 days, Eichmann remained hidden inside a secure safe house. The location was kept strictly confidential. Only a small number of people knew where he was being held. The atmosphere was tense. Every passing day increased the risk of discovery. Outside, life in Buenos Aires continued normally. Inside the safe house, a race against time was underway. The team needed a way to transport Eichmann through airport security, immigration controls, and onto an international flight without revealing who he was. Fortunately, an unusual opportunity was about to present itself. At that exact time, Israel was preparing to send an official delegation to Argentina to participate in celebrations marking the anniversary of the May Revolution. An aircraft belonging to Israel's national airline would soon be returning home. The delegation provided the perfect cover. If everything worked according to plan, Eichmann could leave the country disguised as a member of the flight crew. The plan was bold and incredibly risky. First, the agents prepared forged travel documents. Then they obtained an airline uniform. Finally, they developed a strategy to explain why one crew member might appear ill and unable to communicate normally. On the evening of May 20th, 1960, the operation began. Eichmann was dressed in airline personnel clothing. To reduce the risk of unexpected complications, he was given medication that would leave him calm and largely unresponsive during the journey. The agents carefully loaded him into a vehicle and headed toward the airport. Every checkpoint represented a potential disaster. Every official inspection carried the possibility that someone might ask the wrong question. As they approached immigration control, tension filled the air. The agents presented documents identifying Eichmann as an airline employee suffering from a medical condition that required immediate transport. The explanation was accepted. No alarm was raised. No extended inspection followed. One barrier had been cleared, then another, and another. Eventually, the group reached the aircraft. After years of hiding in Europe and nearly a decade living under a false identity in Argentina, Adolf Eichmann boarded a plane that would take him toward a future he had spent years trying to avoid. The aircraft lifted off. Only then did the agents begin to feel a sense of relief. But the mission still wasn't over. The flight made a scheduled stop in Dakar before continuing toward its final destination. At every stage, secrecy remained essential. The fewer people who knew what was happening, the better. Finally, the plane landed in Israel. For the first time since the end of World War II, Adolf Eichmann was no longer a fugitive. He was a prisoner. Shortly afterward, Israeli Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion addressed the nation. His announcement stunned the world. Adolf Eichmann had been located, captured, and brought to Israel to face justice. Within hours, Newspapers across the globe carried the story. Governments demanded explanations. Journalists rushed to uncover details. The news dominated international headlines. Argentina reacted immediately. Officials protested what they viewed as a violation of national sovereignty. The issue soon reached the international stage, generating intense diplomatic debate. Israel acknowledged the extraordinary nature of the operation but maintained its position. The judicial process would move forward. The trial would take place in Jerusalem. And for the first time, the man who had spent years disappearing into the shadows would be required to answer questions before the world. What followed would become one of the most significant and widely watched trials in modern history. Millions would follow every development. Survivors would share their experiences. Evidence would be presented, and the world would witness a courtroom proceeding unlike any that had come before it. The hunt was over. Now the trial was about to begin. Chapter 7. The Trial That Changed History. By the spring of 1961, preparations were underway in Jerusalem for a trial unlike anything the world had ever seen. This was not simply another courtroom proceeding. It was an event that would capture global attention and bring millions of people face to face with a chapter of history that many were still struggling to understand. To accommodate the proceedings, authorities transformed the Beit Ha'am auditorium in Jerusalem into a specially designed courtroom. At the center of the room stood an unusual structure, a transparent, bullet-resistant glass enclosure. Inside it sat Adolf Eichmann. The enclosure served multiple purposes. Officially, it was designed to protect the defendant from possible attacks, but it also ensured that everyone in the courtroom and millions watching around the world could see him clearly. For the first time in history, a trial of this scale would be extensively televised. Journalists arrived from dozens of countries. Newspapers dedicated entire sections to the proceedings. Radio stations provided daily updates. The world was watching. When the trial opened on April 11, 1961, Eichmann entered the courtroom, wearing a dark suit and headphones connected to a translation system. He appeared calm, reserved, almost ordinary. That image surprised many observers. After years of hearing his name associated with enormous historical events, people expected someone different. Instead, they saw a middle-aged man sitting quietly behind glass. Yet appearances would become one of the central themes of the trial. How could someone who looked so ordinary have played a role in events of such extraordinary consequence? That question would echo throughout the proceedings. Eichmann's defense was led by German attorney Robert Servatius. From the beginning, Servatius challenged the legitimacy of the trial. He argued that Eichmann had been brought to Israel through an unauthorized intelligence operation and questioned whether the court had jurisdiction over the case. The judges listened carefully, then rejected the argument. The trial would continue. Leading the prosecution was Gideon Hausner. Hausner approached the case differently from a traditional criminal prosecution. His objective was not only to examine the actions of one individual. He wanted the court to document an entire historical process. Over the coming months, witness after witness took the stand. Many had never met Eichmann personally, yet their experiences formed part of the broader story that the prosecution sought to present. They described forced relocations. They described life inside ghettos. They described train journeys, separations from family members, and experiences that had remained largely unspoken for years. For many viewers, these testimonies were the first time they had heard such detailed personal accounts broadcast to a global audience. The emotional impact was profound. Inside the glass booth, Eichmann listened through headphones. Most of the time, he appeared composed. He took notes, reviewed documents, occasionally adjusted his glasses. When questioned about his role, he repeatedly offered a similar explanation. He described himself as an administrator, a bureaucrat, someone who transmitted orders rather than created them. According to his defense, he had operated within a chain of command and lacked authority to alter major decisions. It was a strategy that would become famous. But prosecutors possessed evidence that complicated this narrative. One of the most important pieces came from conversations Eichmann had participated in years earlier while living in Argentina. Those discussions had been recorded and later documented. In them, Eichmann spoke far more openly about his wartime activities than he ever would in court. The contrast was striking. Statements made in private appeared very different from the careful answers he now delivered before judges and cameras. As prosecutors introduced these materials, the courtroom atmosphere shifted. The trial was no longer focused solely on documents and administrative records. It had become a direct examination of Eichmann's own words. At the same time, investigators conducted extensive interviews outside the public courtroom. Over hundreds of hours of questioning, Eichmann discussed details of his career, his responsibilities, and his experiences during the war. These sessions produced thousands of pages of transcripts. Together, they provided a far more detailed picture of his role that had been available immediately after the war. As the trial continued, several moments deeply affected those present. Some witnesses struggled to complete their testimony. Others paused for long periods before continuing. The emotional weight of revisiting events from years earlier was often visible throughout the courtroom. Journalists covering the proceedings described an atmosphere unlike anything they had previously encountered. This was more than a legal case. It had become a historical reckoning. Day after day, evidence accumulated. Documents, orders, correspondence, testimony, interrogation records. Each piece added to the growing picture that the judges would eventually have to evaluate. And as the weeks turned into months, one reality became increasingly clear. The verdict would have consequences far beyond the fate of a single defendant. The world wasn't simply watching a trial. It was witnessing history being documented in real time. And eventually, the judges would have to decide whether Adolf Eichmann's explanation, that he was merely following orders, could withstand the evidence placed before them. The answer would come in December 1961. Chapter 8. The Verdict and the Final Hours. After months of testimony, thousands of pages of documents, and countless hours of proceedings, the trial was finally approaching its conclusion. The world waited. Journalists crowded the courtroom, radio stations prepared special broadcasts, newspapers reserved front-page space. Everyone wanted to know how the judges would rule. On December 13, 1961, the courtroom fell silent as presiding judge Moshe Landau began reading the verdict. The decision had taken months to prepare. Every document had been examined, every argument reviewed, every piece of evidence carefully weighed. Inside the glass booth, Adolf Eichmann listened through his headphones. Observers watched closely for signs of emotion. There were few. He remained largely expressionless as the judgment was read. The ruling was unanimous. The judges found Eichmann guilty on multiple counts, including crimes against humanity, war crimes, and crimes against the Jewish people. More importantly, the court rejected the central argument of his defense. The judges concluded that Eichmann had not merely been a passive functionary carrying out instructions. According to the court, the evidence demonstrated active participation in the implementation and administration of the system that had been examined throughout the trial. For months, Eichmann had insisted that he was simply a small part of a larger machine. The judges disagreed. 2 days later, the sentence was announced: death by hanging. The decision immediately sparked international debate. Some legal scholars argued that a special international tribunal would have been a more appropriate venue. Others defended the court's authority and its conclusions. Regardless of the arguments, one fact remained unchanged: the sentence would stand unless overturned on appeal. Eichmann's legal team immediately sought to challenge the verdict. The appeal process moved to the highest judicial level in Israel. For months, lawyers presented their arguments. But in May 1962, the appeal was rejected. The conviction remained intact. The sentence remained unchanged. The legal battle was over. Now, only one possibility remained: a request for clemency. In the weeks that followed, several public figures appealed for the sentence to be commuted to life imprisonment. Among them was the renowned philosopher Martin Buber. Buber did not argue that Eichmann was innocent, Nor did he question the verdict. Instead, he raised a philosophical concern. He believed that no punishment could truly match the scale of the crimes discussed during the trial. Other intellectuals expressed similar views. The debate continued, but ultimately the appeals failed. The request for clemency was denied. The execution would proceed. Meanwhile, Eichmann was being held at Ramla prison. His cell was simple: a bed, a table, a chair, a small window. Guards monitored him continuously. During this period, he established a routine. He spent much of his time reading books on philosophy, biographies, literature, anything available through the prison library. Visitors were limited, but one meeting carried particular significance. His wife, Vera, was permitted to visit him. The meeting took place under strict supervision. Separated by glass, the couple spoke for approximately 90 minutes. They discussed their children, family matters, life outside the prison walls. What they did not discuss, according to available accounts, were the charges that had brought him there. When the visit ended, Vera departed. It would be the last time they saw each other. As the execution date approached, Eichmann submitted a personal plea for mercy. It was reviewed, then rejected. The decision was final. On the evening of May 31, 1962, prison officials informed him that all remaining appeals had failed. The sentence would be carried out that night. Witnesses later reported that he showed little visible reaction. No dramatic outburst, no emotional display. Instead, he spent the evening writing letters to family members. The letters focused on personal matters and farewell messages. He requested cigarettes, a bottle of wine, writing materials. The requests were granted. Hours passed quietly. Guards continued their watch. The prison remained calm. Shortly after midnight, preparations began. The final stage of a process that had started years earlier with a chance discovery in Argentina was now at hand. The man who had spent nearly 15 years hiding under false names and fabricated identities had reached the end of the road. Soon, he would leave his cell for the last time, and one final chapter of the story would begin. Chapter 9: The Execution and the Legacy Left Behind. In the early hours of June 1, 1962, the long legal process finally came to an end. For more than a year, the world had followed the investigation, the trial, the appeals, and the debates that surrounded Adolf Eichmann's case. Now, only a few final moments remained. Shortly after midnight, prison officials entered his cell at Ramla prison. Eichmann was awake. He had spent the evening writing letters, smoking cigarettes, and reflecting quietly in his cell. According to official accounts, he remained calm. No resistance, no dramatic scenes, no final attempts to delay what was coming. The guards informed him that it was time. He stood, adjusted his clothing, and followed them down the corridor. Walking beside him was a Protestant minister who had spoken with him during his imprisonment. The minister offered words of comfort. Eichmann listened politely, but remained reserved. The corridor was silent. Only a small group of officials had been authorized to witness the procedure. Among those present was Adolf Eichmann, one of the key figures involved in the operation that had brought Eichmann from Argentina to Israel 2 years earlier. For him, the moment marked the conclusion of a mission that had begun thousands of miles away on a dark street in Buenos Aires. When Eichmann entered the execution chamber, he climbed the platform without assistance. Officials asked whether he wished to wear a hood. He declined. The room remained quiet. Witnesses later described an atmosphere of complete stillness. The sentence was carried out. Doctors confirmed death shortly afterward. With that, the life of one of the most sought-after fugitives of the 20th century came to an end. But the story was not over. In many ways, it was only beginning. A unique decision. Israeli authorities faced an unusual question after the execution. What should be done with the remains? There was concern that a burial site could become a place of political symbolism or pilgrimage for extremist groups. To prevent that possibility, an unprecedented decision was made. The remains were cremated. The ashes were later transported beyond Israel's territorial waters and scattered at sea. No grave was created, no monument was established, no physical location remained that could become associated with his memory. It was a deliberate decision designed to ensure that no shrine could ever emerge. The impact on the world. The significance of the Eichmann trial extended far beyond the courtroom. Before 1961, many aspects of the Holocaust were known to historians, governments, and survivors. But the trial brought those stories into living rooms across the globe. Millions of people heard first-hand testimony. Millions watched witnesses describe events they had rarely discussed publicly before. For an entire generation, the trial became an educational turning point. It transformed public understanding of one of history's darkest chapters. Universities studied it. Journalists analyzed it. Legal scholars debated it. Historians continue to examine it today. Many experts consider it one of the most influential trials of the 20th century, not because it introduced new crimes to the world, but because it forced the world to listen. The psychological question. Perhaps one of the most enduring questions raised by the trial had little to do with law. It was a question about human behavior. How could someone appear so ordinary while participating in extraordinary events? Throughout the proceedings, Eichmann did not fit the image many people expected. He did not appear charismatic. He did not appear powerful. He often seemed like an average office worker discussing administrative tasks. This contradiction fascinated scholars for decades. One of the most famous analyses came from Hannah Arendt, who attended the trial and later wrote extensively about it. Her observations sparked debates that continue to this day. The trial became not only a legal event, but also a philosophical one. It forced people to think about responsibility, obedience, bureaucracy, and individual choices within large systems. Questions that remain relevant far beyond the historical context of the case itself. A case that never truly ended. Even after the trial concluded, investigators, historians, and journalists continued uncovering new information. Previously classified documents emerged, government archives were opened, new testimonies appeared. Researchers examined the escape networks that had helped former Nazi officials flee Europe after the war. Questions remained about hidden financial assets. Questions remained about international support systems. Questions remained about how so many fugitives managed to evade capture for so long. In many respects, the capture of Adolf Eichmann did not close a chapter of history. It opened new ones. The legacy. Today, more than half a century later, the Eichmann case remains one of the most studied investigations in modern history. It combined intelligence operations, international diplomacy, legal precedent, and historical documentation on an unprecedented scale. From a false identity in post-war Germany, to a modest house on Garibaldi Street in Argentina, to a courtroom in Jerusalem watched by millions, the journey was extraordinary. Yet the lasting significance of the story lies not in the man himself. It lies in the questions his case forced the world to confront. Questions about justice, questions about accountability, questions about memory, and questions about how history should be remembered by future generations. The hunt ended, the trial ended, but the discussions it sparked continue to this day. Chapter 10. The Secret Escape Network and the Hidden Money Trail. By the time Adolf Eichmann arrived in Argentina in 1950, he was far from the only former Nazi official seeking refuge overseas. In fact, he was part of a much larger story, a story that stretched across continents, a story involving secret roots, false identities, sympathetic contacts, and unanswered questions about vast sums of money that seemed to vanish without a trace. For years after World War II, rumors circulated about an underground escape system that helped former members of the Nazi regime disappear. Some called them escape lines, others called them rat lines. Whatever the name, their purpose was simple: move people out of Europe before investigators could find them. And for many, the system worked remarkably well. a continent in chaos. To understand how these escape routes functioned, it's important to remember the condition of Europe after the war. Entire cities had been destroyed. Millions of refugees were moving across borders. Governments were overwhelmed. Records were incomplete. Verification systems were struggling to keep pace with the enormous humanitarian crisis. In that environment, creating a new identity was often easier than it should have been. Thousands of displaced people genuinely needed assistance, and hidden among them were individuals determined to exploit the chaos. The process rarely followed a single blueprint. Instead, it relied on a patchwork of contacts, a recommendation from one person, temporary shelter from another, documents acquired somewhere else. Each step seemed small, but together they formed a pathway leading out of Europe. New names, new lives. For fugitives seeking a fresh start, identity was everything. A new passport, a new profession, a new birthplace, sometimes even a new nationality. The objective was not to create a perfect disguise, it was simply to create enough uncertainty to avoid scrutiny. Once overseas, many of these individuals blended into immigrant communities. Some found work in factories, others entered business, some lived quietly and avoided attention altogether. The most successful fugitives understood one basic rule: visibility was dangerous, anonymity was protection. Eichmann followed that rule almost obsessively. For years, it kept him safe. Why South America? One question historians often ask is simple: why did so many fugitives choose South America? The answer involves several factors. Distance was one. A person living thousands of miles from Europe was naturally harder to locate. Language differences created another layer of separation. And in some countries, immigration policies during the post-war years allowed large numbers of European newcomers to settle and rebuild their lives. Argentina became one of the most significant destinations, but it was not the only one. Communities of European immigrants also developed in countries such as Paraguay, Brazil, and Chile. Over time, these networks became increasingly difficult to track. Some fugitives remained hidden for decades. Others were eventually discovered. Many were never located at all. The mystery of the missing wealth. Yet another mystery emerged alongside the escape routes: money. A lot of money. As the war ended, enormous quantities of assets moved across Europe. Some belonged to governments, some belonged to institutions, some belonged to individuals trying to preserve wealth before the collapse of the Third Reich. For decades, investigators attempted to determine exactly where these assets went. Some records suggested that substantial amounts of money had reached South America through various channels. Other reports pointed toward bank accounts, private investments, businesses and properties established after the war. But tracing those funds proved extraordinarily difficult. False names complicated investigations. Incomplete records created gaps, and in many cases, key participants died before they could be questioned. The result was a puzzle that remains only partially solved. The questions that refused to disappear. Historians continue to debate several major questions. How extensive were the escape networks? Who helped organize them? How much money was transferred overseas? And how much remains hidden today? Each newly opened archive seems to reveal another piece of the story, but rarely the entire picture. Documents emerge, names appear, connections become clearer, yet complete certainty remains elusive. The deeper researchers dig, the more complex the story becomes. Fear. After Eichmann. When news broke in 1960 that Adolf Eichmann had been captured in Argentina, shockwaves spread far beyond Israel and Germany. For many former fugitives, the message was unmistakable. If Eichmann could be found, anyone could. Almost overnight, rumors spread through expatriate communities across South America. People changed addresses. Some adopted new identities. Others reduced public appearances. Several individuals believed to have escaped Europe decades earlier suddenly became far more cautious. The capture created a sense of uncertainty that had not existed before. Distance no longer seemed like a guarantee of safety. Time no longer seemed like protection. The legacy of the network. Today, historians view the escape routes as one of the most fascinating and controversial chapters of the post-war era. They reveal how fragile institutions can become during periods of chaos. They demonstrate how easily individuals can disappear when documentation systems collapse. And they show how the consequences of war often continue long after the fighting ends. For decades, the network remained hidden in fragments: a passport here, a witness statement there, a forgotten archive discovered years later. Each clue added another piece to the puzzle. Yet even now, some parts of the story remain unresolved. And among those unresolved questions is one that continues to attract researchers around the world. What happened to the money? Where did it go? Who inherited it? And how much of it is still waiting to be discovered? Those questions would eventually lead investigators beyond the story of Adolf Eichmann himself and into one of the most intriguing financial mysteries of the 20th century. Chapter 11. The Eichmann family after the trial: revenge, loyalty, and division. For most people, Adolf Eichmann's story ended in June 1962. The trial was over, the sentence had been carried out, the world moved on. But for the Eichmann family, a very different chapter was just beginning. While governments closed files and newspapers shifted their attention elsewhere, Eichmann's wife and children were left to confront a reality that would shape the rest of their lives. How do you live with one of the most infamous surnames in modern history? The answer, it turned out, depended entirely on which member of the family you asked. A family under siege. In Buenos Aires, Eichmann's family followed the trial closely. Every headline, every radio broadcast, every new development. For much of the world, the proceedings represented justice. For the family, they represented something entirely different. They believed Adolf Eichmann had been treated unfairly. They viewed his capture as illegal. They viewed the trial as politically motivated, and they rejected many of the conclusions that emerged from it. At the center of this belief was Eichmann's widow, Vera. Throughout the years that followed, she remained fiercely loyal to her husband. She defended his memory, she challenged the narrative presented during the trial, and she passed those views on to her children. The result would be a family deeply divided by history. Klaus Eichmann, the defender. Of all Eichmann's children, none defended his father more aggressively than his eldest son, Klaus Eichmann. Even before the execution, Klaus had begun speaking publicly. He rejected the accusations against his father. He dismissed evidence presented during the trial, and he portrayed Adolf Eichmann as a victim rather than a perpetrator. To supporters, his statements were expressions of loyalty. To critics, they represented an unwillingness to confront historical reality. Regardless of perspective, Klaus never wavered. Years after the trial ended, he continued defending his father's reputation. His position remained unchanged. Anger turns into action. In the months following the execution, emotions ran high among some members of the expatriate German community in Argentina. For many, Eichmann's death symbolized more than the loss of one man. They viewed it as a humiliation, a defeat, a warning that the past was no longer safely buried. Among younger sympathizers, conversations became increasingly heated. Talk of revenge began to circulate. Some wanted symbolic responses. Others discussed more radical ideas. Authorities would later uncover evidence suggesting that a small group had explored plans involving acts of violence directed at Jewish institutions. Fortunately, those plans never materialized. Law enforcement intervened before any attack could occur. Yet the discovery demonstrated how deeply some individuals remained committed to the ideologies of the past, even decades after the war had ended. A different path. Not all of Eichmann's children followed the same road. One son, Dieter Eichmann, largely avoided public attention. Unlike Klaus, he rarely made public statements. He neither became a vocal defender nor a visible critic. Instead, he attempted to live quietly. As years passed, he maintained an increasingly private existence, staying largely outside public debate. For researchers and journalists, Dieter became one of the most mysterious members of the family. Little was known about his personal views, and he seemed determined to keep it that way. The son who broke away. Then there was Ricardo Eichmann. His story was dramatically different. Born in Argentina, Ricardo was still a child when his father was captured. Unlike some of his older siblings, he grew up during a period when alternative perspectives became impossible to avoid. As he got older, he made a choice that would permanently separate him from parts of his family. He moved to Germany. He pursued higher education, and eventually he built a respected academic career in archaeology. Most importantly, he publicly addressed his father's legacy. In interviews, Ricardo acknowledged the historical record. He accepted the verdict. He stated that what his father had done was wrong. Those comments created a deep rift within the family. Some relatives viewed them as betrayal. Others saw them as honesty. Either way, the divide was permanent. The burden of a name. Few people can truly understand what it means to inherit a name known around the world. For the Eichmann children, the surname became both a burden and a defining feature of their lives. Some embraced it. Some rejected it. Others attempted to escape it entirely. Certain descendants reportedly changed surnames or avoided public attention altogether. Others continued defending family narratives passed down through generations. As decades passed, the family scattered across different countries and different lives. Yet one thing remained constant. Wherever the name appeared, questions followed. Questions about responsibility. Questions about memory. Questions about how future generations should respond to the actions of their ancestors. History's long shadow. The story of the Eichmann family illustrates something larger than one household. It reveals how historical events continue affecting people long after headlines disappear. Trials may end, governments may close investigations, but families often live with the consequences for generations. Some descendants spend their lives confronting the past. Others spend their lives running from it, and some spend decades trying to understand it. The Eichmann family experienced all three. More than 60 years after the trial, the debates surrounding Adolf Eichmann continue. Not because new verdicts are being issued, but because history rarely ends when a courtroom closes. Sometimes, its longest chapter begins afterward, and in this case, that chapter stretched across generations. Chapter 12. The Nazi hunters, the missing archives, and the secrets still hidden today. For many people, Adolf Eichmann's capture in 1960 marked the end of one of history's most significant manhunts. But for the men and women dedicated to tracking down fugitives from the Second World War, it was only the beginning. Eichmann's arrest sent a powerful message across the globe. No matter how much time had passed, some people were still searching, and they weren't planning to stop. The shockwave. After Buenos Aires, the news of Eichmann's capture spread rapidly through expatriate communities across South America. For years, many former fugitives had lived under the assumption that distance guaranteed safety. Thousands of miles separated them from Europe. Many had established families, businesses, and entirely new identities. They believed the world had forgotten them. Then came the headline. Adolf Eichmann had been found, not in a bunker, not in a secret compound, but living openly in a suburb of Buenos Aires. If he could be located after 15 years, who might be next? Almost immediately, reports began circulating of individuals changing addresses, abandoning routines, and becoming far more cautious about public appearances. Fear had returned, and it spread quickly. The hunters who refused to quit. Among the most persistent investigators was Simon Wiesenthal. Although popular culture often portrays Wiesenthal as a lone detective relentlessly tracking fugitives around the world, the reality was more complex. He worked through networks of researchers, informants, journalists, government contacts, and survivors. His greatest strength was persistence. Years after many governments had shifted their priorities, Wiesenthal continued collecting information. Names, addresses, witness statements, fragments of forgotten records. Piece by piece, he helped ensure that many cases remained in the public eye. Not every lead succeeded. Not every suspect was found. But the effort never stopped. And Eichmann's capture gave those efforts renewed momentum. The men who escaped justice. While Eichmann was eventually brought to trial, many others were never captured. Some died before authorities located them. Others benefited from political protection. A few managed to evade serious investigation entirely. One of the most infamous examples was Joseph Mengele. For decades, rumors surrounded his whereabouts. Investigators searched multiple countries. False sightings appeared regularly. Journalists pursued countless leads, yet he remained elusive. When the truth finally emerged years later, it revealed that he had spent much of his life moving quietly between South American countries while avoiding public attention. Another figure who remained beyond the reach of courts for many years was Walter Rauff. Despite repeated efforts to secure extradition, he spent decades living openly in South America. His case became a symbol of how difficult post-war justice could be when political interests and international law collided. These examples reminded investigators of a painful reality. Finding someone was one challenge, bringing them before a court was often another. The mystery of the archives. As decades passed, historians increasingly turned their attention toward government archives. Many believed that countless unanswered questions remained hidden inside official records. Documents, correspondence, intelligence reports, immigration files, financial records. The problem was access. Some archives remained classified for decades. Others were only partially available. In many cases, researchers could see references to documents that were still unavailable for public examination. Every newly released file answered some questions while creating new ones. The result was an ongoing historical puzzle, one that remains incomplete even today. The money trail. Perhaps no mystery generated more speculation than the question of money. Where did the financial resources connected to fleeing Nazi networks go? How much was transferred? Who controlled it? And who inherited it? Researchers have spent decades trying to answer those questions. Some investigations pointed toward bank accounts. Others examined businesses, real estate, investment networks, and private transfers. Yet tracing money across multiple countries, identities, and decades proved extraordinarily difficult. The deeper investigators looked, the more complicated the picture became. For every answer uncovered, another question seemed to appear. The archives that could change everything. In recent years, renewed interest has emerged around previously sealed records relating to wartime escape networks. Historians hope these materials may provide new insight into how certain individuals escaped Europe and how support systems operated after the war. Researchers are particularly interested in uncovering details about transportation routes, financial transfers, immigration assistance networks, government knowledge of fugitive movements, international cooperation, or lack thereof. Many believe the full story has not yet been told, not because evidence is absent, but because portions of that evidence remain inaccessible. For historians, every newly opened archive represents another opportunity to understand a complicated period of history more clearly. Why the story still matters. More than 80 years after the end of World War II, people continue studying the Eichmann case. Not because it is simply a story about one individual, but because it touches so many larger themes. The power of bureaucracy, the consequences of ideology, the challenges of justice, the role of memory, and the question of how societies respond to historical wrongdoing. Eichmann's journey, from post-war Germany to Argentina, from anonymity to international trial, became one of the defining investigations of the 20th century. Yet, it also revealed something broader. History is rarely as simple as it appears. Behind every headline are hidden networks. Behind every investigation are unanswered questions. And behind every archive are stories still waiting to be discovered. The final question. Today, researchers continue searching. Documents continue emerging. New generations continue examining old evidence. And perhaps the most fascinating aspect of the entire story is this. Even after decades of investigations, trials, books, documentaries, and declassified files, we still do not know everything. Some records remain sealed, some witnesses are gone, some answers may never be found. But the search continues, because history is not only about what we know, it is also about what we have yet to uncover. And somewhere, buried within forgotten archives and unopened files, there may still be pieces of the story waiting to be revealed.